Hello everyone and welcome back to Shadow Man Stories. I can picture some of you already in bed, maybe some of you just getting home from work. Wherever you are, whatever time it is, I'm glad you're here. If this helps you relax or sleep, please like and subscribe. It means a lot. Now, let's get you comfortable, and I'll tell you tonight's story. My name is Jackson Grimwald, and I've been a park ranger at Seneca Rocks for 13 years now. Before that, I flew helicopters for the Army. Good job, steady pay, seeing the world from up high. But then my bird went down in Afghanistan, and I spent 6 months in a hospital bed thinking about what came next. The mountains called to me. Maybe it was all that time looking down at them from the cockpit, but something about these West Virginia peaks felt like home. Seneca Rocks isn't like other parks. It's just one big wall of stone rising 900 feet straight up from the valley floor. Rock climbers come from all over to test themselves against it. My job is keeping them safe, teaching rope techniques, checking equipment, running rescues when someone gets stuck or hurt. In 13 years, I've pulled more than 500 people off that rock face. Some grateful, some embarrassed. All of them alive because I know how to read the mountain. November of 1967 was colder than usual. Heavy clouds sat on the peaks like a gray blanket, and electrical storms rolled through every few days, the kind of weather that makes climbers nervous and park rangers busier. I was checking the radio tower on the ridge above the visitor center when I first heard the stories. 3 different climbing teams had reported the same thing over the past week. A flying man watching them from impossible positions on the rock face. Always during the late afternoon, always in the same general area, about 300 feet up the main wall near what we call Devil's Chimney. At first, I figured it was hang gliders. We get them sometimes, though they're not supposed to fly near the climbing routes. Maybe someone with a death wish trying to thread the needle between the rock spires. But when I checked with the Federal Aviation Administration, they had no reports of aircraft in the area, no flight plans filed, no emergency CKLS. The descriptions were all similar, too. A tall figure, maybe 7 feet, with enormous wings, dark against the gray stone, but with 2 red lights where the eyes should be. The climbers said it would just sit there, watching, like it was studying their every move. I'm a practical man. 13 years in these mountains teaches you to trust what you can see and touch. But I'm also a pilot, and pilots learn to respect things that don't make sense right away. Strange weather patterns, instrument readings that don't add up, the feeling that something's not right even when everything looks normal. Something wasn't right at Seneca Rocks. The first thing I noticed was the quiet. Not the good kind of quiet you get in deep wilderness, but the wrong kind. Like all the animals had packed up and moved somewhere else. No bird songs in the morning, no deer coming down to drink from the creek. Even the chipmunks seemed to have vanished. My equipment started acting up too. The radio would work fine all day, then suddenly fill with static and high-pitched whining sounds right around sunset. My compass spun like a lazy Susan whenever I got within 50 yards of the main climbing wall, and twice my truck wouldn't start in the morning, battery dead as a doornail, though it had been fine the night before. Dr. Sarah Nightshade from West Virginia University drives up to help me figure it out. Sarah studies birds, big ones especially, and she knows more about what flies in these mountains than anyone. I show her the reports, ask if maybe we've got some kind of rare eagle or hawk. She listens, nods, asks good questions. Then she tells me what I already suspected. There's nothing in North America with a 15-foot wingspan that looks even remotely human. The biggest eagles top out around 8 feet, and they sure don't hover in one spot for 20 minutes watching rock climbers. What your witnesses are seeing, she says, packing up her field guides. It's not from any ornithology textbook I've ever read. That night I stayed late at the ranger station, updating incident reports and trying to make sense of the pattern. The stories were too consistent to ignore, but too impossible to believe. As a pilot, I knew the physics. Nothing that size could fly in the downdrafts and crosswinds around Seneca Rocks. The air currents would tear it apart. But as I sat there typing, something made me look up from my desk. Through the window, silhouetted against the storm clouds gathering over the peaks, I saw it. A shape that shouldn't exist, perched on a rock spire where no living thing could land. The shape was huge, bigger than any bird, smaller than an aircraft, but wrong in ways that made my pilot's brain hurt. It sat completely still on a narrow ledge 400 feet up the north face, a place I knew from 13 years of rescues. That ledge was barely 6 inches wide and angled downward. Even with climbing gear, a human would slide right off. I grabbed my binoculars and focused on the spot. For just a moment, I saw details that didn't make sense. A body that looked almost human but stretched too tall. Wings folded against its back like a giant bat, and 2 points of red light where a head should be, staring directly at me. Then lightning flashed, and when my eyes readjusted, the ledge was empty. I called it in to dispatch, more out of procedure than hope. Unidentified object on north face, possibly aircraft in distress. But even as I said the words, I knew how crazy they sounded. No aircraft could land on that ledge. Nothing could. The next morning brought our first real incident. Tom Bradley, a climbing instructor from Virginia, fell 60 feet when his rope anchor failed. By all rights, he should have died. The anchor was set in solid rock, tested with twice his body weight. Equipment doesn't just fail like that, but Tom lived because something slowed his fall. It was like flying through thick air, he told me in the hospital, his leaves. Out arm in a cast, but otherwise unhurt. Right before I hit the rocks, everything went strange. The air got heavy, like soup, and I just floated down the last 30 feet. His climbing partner backed up the story. Maria Santos had 20 years of experience on rock faces around the world. She didn't make things up, and she didn't panic. But she was shaking when she talked to me. Jackson, I saw wings. I know how that sounds. But something with enormous wings swooped down and got under Tom right before impact. It caught him, slowed him down, then vanished. I hiked up to check the scene myself. The failed anchor made no sense. Solid protection in perfect rock, no signs of metal fatigue or improper installation. But 30 feet below, where Tom said the floating started, I found something that raised the hair on my neck. Scratches in the stone. 4 parallel gouges, each one 3 inches deep and carved into quartzite that would turn a chisel blade. The marks were fresh, and they looked exactly like claw marks from something large enough to carry a grown man. That afternoon, I met Joseph Crowfeather at the general store in town. Joseph guided hunting parties in the backcountry and knew these mountains better than anyone. His great-grandfather had been Cherokee, and Joseph remembered the old stories. Thunderbird, he said when I described what people were seeing. My great-grandfather called it Navi, guardian spirit of the mountain people, shows up when bad things are coming. Bad things like what? Joseph looked toward Seneca Rocks, barely visible through the afternoon haze. Death, disaster, things that hurt the earth and the people on it. Navi tries to warn us, but most folks don't listen. You believe in this stuff. I believe my great-grandfather lived to be 96 in these mountains without GPS or weather radio. He knew things we forgot how to know. I drove home thinking about that conversation. As a ranger, I'd learned to respect local knowledge. The old-timers who'd spent their whole lives in these hills often knew more about weather, patterns, and animal behavior than any university study. But guardian spirits? Flying thunderbirds? My skepticism lasted until that evening. I was checking the climbing route permits in my cabin when every light in the place went out. The refrigerator stopped humming, the electric clock stopped ticking, and even my battery-powered radio went silent. Total electronic failure. But outside, something was glowing. I looked through my kitchen window and saw it standing in the clearing behind my cabin. 7 feet tall, man-shaped, but wrong in every detail. Its wings weren't folded anymore. They stretched out 15 feet on each side, dark as night except for a faint shimmer like oil on water. And where its face should be, 2 red lights burned like hot coals. We stared at each other for maybe 30 seconds. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't think of anything except that I was looking at something that shouldn't exist. The fear wasn't normal fear. It was deeper than that, like every instinct I'd inherited from ancestors who knew there were things in the dark that hunted humans. Then it moved. not walking or running, but flowing forward like smoke given shape. It came right up to the window, and those red eyes fixed on mine. For just a moment, I felt something touch my mind. Not thoughts exactly, but images. Flashes of disaster. A bridge falling. Men trapped underground. Fire and screaming and death. The creature pressed one hand against the glass. Through the window I could see it clearly. Long fingers ending in claws that could carve stone, skin that looked like shadows made solid. When it pulled its hand away, the glass was warm to the touch. Then every light in the cabin came back on at once. The radio crackled to life, the refrigerator resumed humming, and the electric clock started ticking again. I looked outside, but the clearing was empty. On the wind, now, though, was a perfect handprint. 5 long fingers pressed into the glass from the outside, as clear and permanent as if burned there by acid. I called in sick the next day and drove to the library in Charleston. If this thing was some kind of guardian spirit, if it was trying to warn people about disasters, I needed to know everything the Cherokee had recorded about Thunderbirds. I needed to understand what I was dealing with. What I found in the old books made my blood run cold. The Cherokee stories about envy went back centuries, a spirit that came before great disasters trying to warn the people. The descriptions matched what I'd seen. Enormous wings, burning red eyes, and the ability to appear and vanish without warning. But the most important detail was this: envy never appeared without good reason. According to the stories, the Thunderbird showed itself only when many lives were at stake. A flood that would wash away entire villages. A landslide that would bury a hunting party. A fire that would consume the forests. It tried to warn people, but few understood its message until it was too late. I drove back to Seneca Rocks with a head full of questions and a growing certainty that something terrible was coming. The creature, envy, the Thunderbird, the Mothman, whatever name fit, hadn't just been watching climbers. It had been trying to communicate. The next few days brought more sightings. A family camping at the base of the rocks reported a giant birdman circling their tent at midnight. A climbing team saw it perched on the summit at dawn, wings spread against the sunrise. Each time, witnesses reported the same overwhelming sense of dread, the same feeling that something was deeply wrong. But it was Dr. Nightshade who helped me understand what the creature was really trying to say. She called me on Thursday morning, voice tight with excitement and fears. Jackson, I've been monitoring the seismic sensors at the university. There's something happening underground near Seneca Rocks. Small tremors, very regular, like machinery running. Machinery? The Consolidation Coal Company has mining rights about 8 miles south of the park. They've been working a deep shaft for 6 months, going after a vein of high-grade coal. If they've hit a gas pocket or an unstable seam. She didn't need to finish. Coal mine disasters were part of West Virginia history. Explosions that killed dozens, cave-ins that buried whole crews alive. If something was going wrong at the mine, if the creature had somehow sensed it. That night, I hiked up to the summit of Seneca Rocks. If the Thunderbird wanted to communicate, if it was really trying to warn me about something, maybe being closer to its territory would help. The climb took 3 hours in the dark, using headlamp and rope to navigate routes I could do blindfolded in daylight. At the top, 900 feet above the valley floor, I waited. The creature came just after midnight. This time there was no fear. Maybe because I was expecting it, maybe because I was finally ready to listen. It landed 20 feet away, wings folding against its back like a black cape. Up close, I could see details that the darkness had hidden before. Its skin wasn't solid. It seemed to shift and flow like smoke, as if the creature was only partly in our world. The red eyes weren't really eyes at all, but points of light that pulsed like a heartbeat. And when it moved, it left no footprints on the stone. It stepped toward me, and suddenly my mind was flooded with visions. I saw the Consolidation coal mine as if from above, like a helicopter view. Deep underground, men worked in tunnels that stretched for miles. But something was wrong with the support timbers. I could see cracks spreading through wooden beams, metal supports bending under impossible weight. And deeper down, a pocket of methane gas growing larger by the hour. The vision changed. I saw the disaster as it would happen. A support beam failing. Tons of rock crashing down, trapping 47 men in the deepest tunnel. The gas pocket rupturing, filling the mine with deadly fumes. Rescue teams arriving too late to save anyone. Then I saw the timeline. The creature showed me a clock, the hands moving forward. 48 hours. The disaster would happen in 48 hours unless someone acted. The vision faded, and the Thunderbird stepped back. Those burning eyes fixed on mine, and I understood. It wasn't just showing me what would happen. It was asking me to stop it. "You want me to warn them," I said out loud. "You want me to get those miners out before the cave-in." The creature nodded once, a perfectly human gesture from something that wasn't human at all. Then it spread its wings and launched into the air, disappearing into the darkness above the peaks. I made it down the mountain in record time and drove straight to the Consolidation Coal office in town. But it was 3 a.m. and the building was locked. I tried calling the emergency number, but the night supervisor thought I was drunk or crazy. "Flying Birdman told you our mine's gonna collapse? That's the best story I've heard all week, buddy." I spent the rest of the night researching the mine, trying to find some other way to convince them. The consolidation operation was bigger than I'd thought. 3 shifts working around the clock, extracting coal from seams 800 feet underground. Safety inspections were up to date, equipment was modern, and the company had a good record. On paper, everything looked fine. But the Thunderbird had shown me truth, not paperwork. And I had less than 2 days to figure out how to save 47 lives without sounding like a lunatic. Friday morning brought bad news. Tom Bradley, the climber who'd fallen earlier in the week, called from the hospital. His injuries were worse than the doctors had first thought. Internal bleeding they'd missed. He needed emergency surgery and his chances weren't good. That afternoon, Maria Santos found me at the ranger station. She was packing up her gear, heading home to Virginia earlier than planned. "This place feels wrong, Jackson," she said. "I've been climbing for 20 years and I've never felt anything like this. It's like the mountain is holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen." She was right. The whole area felt stretched tight, like a guitar string about to snap. Wildlife was still scarce, my equipment kept malfunctioning, and the electrical storms were getting stronger. Even the rock face itself looked different. Shadows fell wrong, and the stone seemed to absorb light instead of reflecting it. That evening, the Thunderbird appeared again. This time it came to the ranger station, landing silently on the roof. I went outside and found it perched above the main entrance, wings folded, red eyes focused on something in the distance. Following its gaze, I could just make out the lights of the consolidation mine operation 8 miles south. The creature looked down at me and spread one wing, pointing toward the mine. Then it held up what looked like a hand, fingers extended. 5. It folded one finger down. 4. Another finger. 3. The timeline was getting shorter. I tried one more time to reach someone at the mine who would listen. The shift supervisor was a man named Pete Carson, 30 years in coal country, with a reputation for caring about his crews. I drove to his house, knocked on his door at 11 p.m., and told him everything. Pete listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. "You know how crazy this sounds?" he finally said. "Yeah, I also know I've spent 13 years keeping people alive in these mountains. I don't make stuff up." Pete rubbed his eyes. "Let's say I believe you. Let's say something's gonna go wrong in my mine tomorrow. You got any idea how much it costs to shut down a shift? How many people will lose their jobs if we call off work? Every time someone has a bad dream? 47 people will lose more than their jobs if you don't." He stared at me for another minute, then nodded slowly. "I'll think about it. Can't promise more than that." It wasn't enough. I could see it in his eyes. He wanted to believe me, but the practical side of mining would win out. He'd run his shift as scheduled, and 47 men would die because their supervisor couldn't act on a warning from a creature that shouldn't exist. I drove home through the storm, windshield wipers fighting sheets of rain, knowing I had less than 18 hours to prevent a disaster that only I knew was coming. The Thunderbird was waiting for me in my cabin. It stood in my living room like a shadow given form, red eyes pulsing in the darkness. This time, when it touched my mind, the vision was different, more urgent, more detailed. I saw the mine shaft from the inside, support beam C-47 in Tunnel 7, a hairline crack that would spread under pressure from the noon shift. The methane pocket was larger than I'd first seen, a deadly bubble of gas waiting to rupture. And the men, I could see their faces now. Real people with families and dreams and no idea they were walking into a tomb. But I also saw something else, a way to prevent it. The creature showed me a maintenance tunnel that connected to the main shaft. If I could reach it, if I could create enough noise and disruption at exactly the right time, the shift would be evacuated before the cave-in. It would look like equipment failure, maybe sabotage, but the miners would be alive. The vision faded, and the Thunderbird stepped closer. For the first time, I felt no fear at all, only a sense of partnership. This ancient spirit had chosen me as its agent in the human world. Together, we could prevent the disaster. "I understand," I said, "but I'll need help getting there." The creature nodded once, then moved to the window. Outside, the storm was getting worse, lightning every few seconds, rain coming down in torrents. Perfect cover for what I had to do. I grabbed my climbing gear and emergency kit, the same equipment I used for mountain rescues. Rope, flashlight, first aid supplies, and a small explosive charge we kept for emergency situations. If I could get into that maintenance tunnel, one small blast in the right place would trigger every safety system in the mine. The drive to Consolidation Coal took 45 minutes through the storm. I parked a quarter-mile from the main gate and hiked through the woods, following a route I'd scouted on maps earlier. The mine operated 3 shifts around the clock. Right now, the graveyard crew was working deep underground while the day shift slept. Security was light. One guard at the main gate, another at the equipment shed, both of them focused on staying dry rather than watching for intruders. I made it to the maintenance building without being seen. The entrance to Tunnel 7 was exactly where the Thunderbird had shown me. A narrow shaft that dropped 200 feet straight down before connecting to the main mining operation. I rigged my rappelling gear and started the descent. Halfway down, I heard it, the sound of wings in the darkness above. The creature was following me, guiding me, making sure I reached the right place at the right time. Its presence made the tunnel feel less like a tomb and more like a passage toward something important. The bottom of the shaft opened into a horizontal tunnel that ran for half a mile before connecting to the main mine. I could hear machinery in the distance, voices calling back and forth, the sound of men working deep underground. The night shift, going about their jobs with no idea that death was waiting in support beam C-47. I followed the tunnel, guided by the creature's visions, until I reached the connection point. Through a gap in the rock wall, I could see the main mining operation. Dozens of men with headlamps, massive equipment carving, coal from the seam, support beams holding back millions of tons of stone. And there it was, beam C-47, with a crack so fine it was barely visible. In 6 hours, when the day shift arrived and the heavy equipment started running, that crack would spread. The beam would fail. The tunnel would collapse. I placed my explosive charge against the wall of the maintenance tunnel, directly opposite the main shaft. A small blast, just enough to trigger the mine's automatic safety systems. Smoke alarms, gas detectors, structural monitors, they'd all go off at once, forcing an immediate evacuation. As I worked, I felt the Thunderbird's presence like a warm hand on my shoulder. It was still with me, still guiding me, still determined to prevent the disaster. For the first time in my life, I understood what it meant to be part of something larger than myself. The charge was set for 6:30 a.m., 30 minutes before the day shift arrived. That would give the safety crews time to evacuate everyone and inspect the damage. They'd find the crack in beam C-47, realize how close they'd come to catastrophe, and probably shut down the operation for weeks of safety improvements. I made it back to the maintenance shaft and started the long climb to the surface. But as I emerged from the tunnel, something went wrong. The guard from the equipment shed was waiting for me. "Hold it right there," he said, flashlight beam centered on my face. You're trespassing on private property." I raised my hands, mind racing. If they called the police, if they found the explosive charge, if they detained me for even an hour, the miners would still be underground when Beam C-47 failed. "I'm Jackson Grimwald, park ranger at Seneca Rocks," I said. "There's been an accident on the mountain. I need to use your radio to call for help." The guard squinted at me through the rain. "What kind of accident?" "Climber's tray hopped on the rock face. My radio's dead and I don't have time to drive back to town." It was a lie, but a believable one. Rangers did emergency rescues at all hours, and we'd occasionally used mine radios when our own equipment failed. The guard hesitated, then nodded toward the main building. "Radio's inside, but make it quick." I followed him to the communications room, where I made a fake call to dispatch about a non-existent climbing accident. As I talked, I watched the clock on the wall, 5:47 a.m. Less than an hour until the charge went off. The guard relaxed, apparently convinced by my performance. "You need an escort back to your truck?" "No thanks. I know these woods pretty well." I made it to my vehicle and drove back toward town. Every nerve on edge. If something went wrong, if the charge didn't work, or if they found it before it detonated, 47 men would die in less than 2 hours. At 6:30 a.m. exactly, I felt it rather than heard it, a small tremor that shook the ground under my truck. Then, a few minutes later, the sirens started. Emergency vehicles racing toward the mine, ambulances and fire trucks responding to what they thought was an equipment failure. I turned on the radio and listened to the reports. Explosion in Maintenance Tunnel 7, structural damage detected in main shaft. All personnel evacuated safely. No injuries reported. They'd found the crack in Beam C-47 during the post-blast inspection. The mine would be closed for at least a month while engineers figured out how close they'd come to losing their entire operation. 47 lives saved by a small explosive charge and the intervention of something that shouldn't exist. I drove back to Seneca Rocks as the sun rose over the peaks. The storm was clearing, and for the first time in weeks, the mountain felt normal again. Birds were singing, deer tracks marked the muddy ground around the visitor center, and my radio worked perfectly. The Thunderbird was waiting for me at the ranger station. It stood beside my truck as I parked, wings folded, red eyes calm instead of urgent. When I got out, it approached without the otherworldly dread I'd felt before. This time, its presence felt almost friendly. The creature reached out and touched my forehead with one long finger. The contact was warm, electric, and it left me with a gift I hadn't expected. I could see things now. Not the future exactly, but patterns, signs, the small wrongnesses that preceded bigger disasters. A sensitivity to the mountain's moods and the ability to read weather patterns like a book. The Thunderbird had made me its partner in the human world, its agent for preventing tragedies that only we could see coming. The creature spread its massive wings, looked at me one last time, and launched into the morning sky. It disappeared beyond the rock spires, but I knew it wasn't really gone. It was part of the mountain now, and I was part of its eternal watch. The official report listed the mine incident as equipment malfunction with structural damage. Nobody asked too many questions about how the maintenance tunnel had exploded or why the safety systems had detected problems that might have gone unnoticed for days. 47 miners went home to their families that night, and most of them never knew how close they'd come to dying. Pete Carson called me a week later. "Don't know how you knew," he said. "Don't really want to know. But my boys are alive because of you. That's all that matters." The crack in Beam C-47 had been worse than anyone realized. The engineers said the whole section would have collapsed within days, probably during the heaviest shift when the most men were underground. The mine stayed closed for 6 weeks while they reinforced every tunnel and replaced hundreds of support beams. But for me, the real change was just beginning. The touch of the Thunderbird had left me different. Not superhuman, nothing like the comic books, but more aware. I could feed into the mountain's moods now, sense when storms were coming hours before the Weather Service issued warnings. And sometimes, in quiet moments, I'd get flashes of places where people were in danger. A week after the mine incident, I woke up with a clear image of a bridge in Harrison County, an old steel span over the Monongahela River. In my vision, I could see stress fractures in the support cables, metal fatigue that would cause a collapse during the next heavy snow. I called the county engineer and reported what I'd observed during a routine inspection. They sent a crew to check the bridge and found exactly what I'd described. The span was closed for emergency repairs 2 days before the first blizzard of the season. A month later, it was the apartment building in Morgantown. Gas leak in the basement that would have killed 20 families if someone hadn't made an anonymous call to the fire department at exactly the right time. I started keeping a journal of these incidents, not for any official purpose, but because I needed to understand what was happening to me. The Thunderbird had given me a gift, but it was also a responsibility. I was seeing disasters before they happened, and that meant I had to act. Over the next year, I prevented 14 accidents that would have killed or injured hundreds of people. Car crashes, building collapses, flash floods. I'd get a vision, find a way to warn the right people, and watch disaster turn into narrow escape. Nobody knew about my involvement except me and the creature that had chosen me. The Thunderbird itself appeared only occasionally now. Sometimes I'd catch a glimpse of it perched on the high peaks during electrical storms. Once I saw it circling above a family reunion that turned dangerous when someone's campfire spread to the dry grass. But mostly, I just felt its presence. A warm touch in the back of my mind, letting me know I wasn't alone in this work. Dr. Nightshade visited again the following spring. "You look different, Jackson," she said as we hiked up to check eagle nests on the north face. "More, I don't know, settled? Like you found something you were looking for." I had found something. Purpose, maybe. Or just the knowledge that some mysteries are meant to be lived rather than solved. The Thunderbird was part of these mountains, part of the ancient agreement between the land and the people who walked on it. And now, I was part of that agreement too. 13 years I'd been keeping climbers safe on Seneca Rocks. Now I was keeping people safe across 3 counties, guided by visions from a creature that existed in the spaces between what we know and what we fear. It was a strange life, but it was mine. Joseph Crow Feather stopped by the ranger station that summer. "My great-grandfather would be proud," he said, looking toward the high peaks where the Thunderbird made its home. "Navi chose well. The guardian spirit needs human hands to do its work in the world." "You knew this would happen?" Joseph smiled. "I hoped it would. These mountains have been waiting a long time for someone who could see with more than just their eyes." As I write this, 5 years have passed since that November night when I first saw the creature perched on an impossible ledge. I'm still a park ranger at Seneca Rocks, still running rescues and keeping climbers safe. But I'm also something more. A bridge between the world of everyday dangers and the deeper mysteries that watch over us. The Thunderbird still appears when the need is great. Last month, I saw it circling above a school in Elkins the night before a boiler explosion that would have killed 30 children. The day before that, it led me to a hiking trail where a flash flood would have swept away a family of tourists. People call it intuition when I show up at exactly the right moment to prevent disaster. Lucky guesses. Good instincts. They don't need to know the truth, that something ancient and powerful decided the human world needed a guardian, and that guardian chose me. Some nights when the storms roll across the peaks and lightning illuminates the rock faces, I climb to the summit of Seneca Rocks and wait. The Thunderbird comes when it needs to share a vision, when there's a disaster I need to prevent. We don't communicate in words. We don't need to. The connection between us runs deeper than language. I used to think I understood the mountains. 13 years of rescue work, of reading weather patterns and rock formations, of knowing every route and ridge from memory. But the Thunderbird taught me that knowledge and wisdom are different things. Knowledge is what you learn from books and experience. Wisdom is what you inherit from the spirits that were here before you and will be here after you're gone. The creature gave me more than visions. It gave me a place in the great web of protection that stretches across these ancient hills. Every life I save, every disaster I prevent, adds another thread to that web. And somewhere in the darkness above the peaks, the Thunderbird watches and waits, ready to guide me toward the next person who needs saving. My name is Jackson Grimwald, and I've been a park ranger at Seneca Rocks for 18 years now. But I'm also something else, the human agent of a guardian spirit that has been protecting these mountains since before the Cherokee gave it a name. The Thunderbird is real. It chose me. And as long as I draw breath in these hills, I'll answer its call. The mountains are never really quiet. You just have to know how to listen. My name is Samuel Darkwood, and I've been studying plants in West Virginia's mountains for 21 years. People call me the plant man, and I guess that's fair. I know every tree, flower, and moss that grows in these hills. I've got a master's degree in botany, and I've written papers that smart people in universities read. But none of that prepared me for what I found in Dolly Sods. You need to understand something about me first. I almost became a preacher. Spent 3 years in seminary, learning about God and faith and miracles. But when my little sister died of cancer at age 8, all those prayers felt empty. I left the church and came to the mountains instead. Nature made more sense to me than God ever did. Dolly Sods isn't like other places in West Virginia. It sits high up on the mountain, about 4,000 feet above sea level. The ground is boggy and wet, covered in cranberry marshes and strange little plants you won't find anywhere else. Stunted pine trees grow twisted and bent by the wind. When the fog rolls in, which it does almost every morning, you can't see 10 feet in any direction. It was September 1978 when everything changed. The morning air was cold, maybe 55 degrees, and frost covered the ground even though it was still early fall. I was leading a team of 3 other botanists from the university. We'd come to study why certain plants grew in patterns up there that didn't make sense. Dr. Mary Thornfield was with us. She was about my age, maybe a year or 2 younger, with short brown hair and thick glasses. She'd been studying mountain plants longer than anyone I knew. Then there was Jim Crawford, a graduate student who talked too much and acted like he knew everything. The last member was Sarah Mills, a quiet girl who took careful notes and asked good questions. We set up our camp near bare rocks, where the ground was a little drier. The fog was so thick that first morning that we could barely see our own tents, but when it started to lift around 9 o'clock, that's when I saw it. Plants don't grow in perfect circles. They don't arrange themselves in straight lines across acres of bog. But that's exactly what we were looking at. Hundreds of mountain laurel bushes, each one exactly the same size, forming patterns that looked almost like they'd been planted by hand. "Well, I'll be damned," Mary said, pushing her glasses up her nose. "Sam, you ever see anything like this?" I hadn't. In 21 years of walking these mountains, I'd never seen plants behave this way. Jim was already taking pictures, clicking away with his camera like he'd found buried treasure. Sarah was making sketches in her notebook, trying to capture the exact shapes. But something felt wrong. The air was too still. No birds were singing, which was strange for that time of morning. Even the insects seemed quieter than they should be. And there was a smell in the air, sweet, but with something rotten underneath it, like flowers left too long in a vase. I knelt down next to one of the laurel bushes. The soil around it was black and rich, but the strange thing was how the roots were arranged. They formed perfect spirals, like someone had wound them by hand. I'd never seen root systems grow that way. "These plants are blooming," Sarah said quietly. She was crouched about 20 feet away, staring at a cluster of wild azaleas. "Sam, azaleas don't bloom in September." She was right. Those flowers should have been done months ago. But here they were, bright pink blossoms covering the bushes like it was May instead of September. And they weren't just blooming. They were thriving in soil that should have been too acidic for them. I pulled out my soil testing kit and took samples. The pH readings made no sense. The ground should have bees, and acidic from all the pine needles and bog water, but my instruments showed it was perfectly neutral. That was impossible. "Maybe there's minerals in the ground," Jim suggested, "some kind of underground deposit that's changing the soil." It was a reasonable guess, but something in my gut told me it wasn't that simple. I'd tested soil all over these mountains, and I'd never seen readings like this. We spent the rest of the day mapping the plant patterns and taking more samples. By the time we set up for dinner, we'd documented over 50 different species growing in impossible arrangements. Flowers blooming out of season, trees growing in perfect geometric shapes, mosses forming patterns that looked almost like letters in some foreign language. That night, around the campfire, Mary was quiet. She kept looking out into the darkness beyond our circle of light. "You okay?" I asked her. "Something's not right here, Sam," she said. "In 30 years of studying plants, I've never seen anything like this. Plants don't just decide to grow in patterns. Something's making them do it." Jim laughed. "Come on, Dr. Thornfield. Plants are just plants. There's got to be a scientific explanation." But Mary shook her head. "I grew up in these mountains, Jim. My grandmother used to tell stories about places like this, places where the old knowledge still worked." "What kind of old knowledge?" Sarah asked. Mary stared into the fire. "The kind that makes plants grow where they shouldn't, bloom when they shouldn't, and arrange themselves into patterns that mean something to people who know how to read them." I didn't say anything, but her words made the hair on my arm stand up, because deep down, I was starting to think she might be right. The next morning, Sarah was sick. She woke up with a rash covering her arms and neck, red welts that looked like she'd been stung by 100 bees. But we hadn't seen any bees or wasps the day before. In fact, we'd hardly seen any insects at all. "It itches so bad," she said, scratching at the red marks, "and I feel dizzy." Mary looked at the rash and frowned. "This looks like poison ivy, but worse. Sarah, did you touch any plants yesterday without gloves?" "Just a few," Sarah admitted, "but nothing that should have caused this." I was worried, but we were 15 miles from the nearest road and another 20 miles from the nearest hospital. We gave Sarah some antihistamine from our first aid kit and hoped it would help. While Mary stayed with Sarah, Jim and I decided to explore deeper into the bog. The fog was thicker that morning, so thick we could barely see each other even when we were just a few feet apart. "Stay close," I told Jim. "It's easy to get turned around in this stuff." We followed one of the plant patterns, a line of mountain ash trees that seemed to lead deeper into the wilderness. The trees were all exactly the same height and spaced exactly 10 feet apart. It was like following a road made of trees. After about a mile, the fog started to thin out, and that's when we saw the garden. It was impossible. Right in the middle of the wilderness, someone had planted a perfect garden. Rows of corn, beans, and squash grew in neat lines. Tomatoes hung heavy on their vines, and pumpkins sat fat and orange on the ground. But this was September in the mountains. The growing season should have been over weeks ago. "How is this here?" Jim whispered. I didn't have an answer. The garden was maybe an acre in size, surrounded by a fence made of twisted branches. Everything in it was perfectly tended, like someone had been weeding and watering it just that morning. But we were miles from any house or road. No one could possibly maintain a garden this far out in the wilderness. "Look at this," Jim said. He was standing next to a row of herbs I didn't recognize. The plants had thick, waxy leaves and gave off a smell that was both sweet and bitter. I've never seen anything like these. I knelt down to examine them closer. The leaves had a pattern of veins that looked almost like writing, and when I touched one, it felt warm, like it had been sitting in the sun all day, even though the morning was cold and cloudy. That's when I heard the humming. It was soft at first, like someone humming a lullaby far away. But as I listened, it got clearer. An old woman's voice humming a tune I'd never heard before. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You hear that?" I asked Jim. "Hear what?" The humming stopped. I stood up slowly, looking around the garden. The fog had gotten thicker again, and I couldn't see past the fence anymore, but I had the strong feeling that someone was watching us. "We should go," I said. "But this is incredible," Jim argued. "We need to document this, take pictures, collect samples." "No," I said, and my voice was sharper than I intended. "We need to leave, now." Something in my tone must have convinced him, because he nodded and followed me back toward the tree line. But as we walked away, I heard the humming again. This time it sounded closer, like someone was walking right behind us. I turned around, but there was nothing there except fog. When we got back to camp, Sarah was worse. The rash had spread to her face, and her eyes were so swollen she could barely open them. Mary was pacing back and forth, worried. "We need to get her out of here," Mary said. "She needs a doctor." "It's going to take us all day to hike back to the truck," I said. "Can she make it that far?" Sarah tried to sit up, but she was too dizzy. "I don't think I can walk very far," she admitted. That's when Jim made his mistake. "Maybe it's something in the garden," he said. "We found this incredible garden about a mile from here. Someone's growing all kinds of plants that shouldn't exist. Maybe Sarah touched something poisonous." Mary stared at him. "What garden?" I tried to stop him, but Jim was excited and kept talking. "It's amazing, Dr. Thornfield. Perfect rows of vegetables, herbs I've never seen before. Someone's maintaining it, Riss. Get out here in the middle of nowhere." "You went into someone's garden without permission?" Mary asked. "It's not like that," Jim said. "There was no one around. It looked abandoned." But Mary was shaking her head. "You don't understand. Gardens like that, this far out in the wilderness, they're not abandoned. Someone's taking care of them. Someone who doesn't want visitors." "Come on," Jim said. "You don't really believe in mountain witch stories, do you?" Mary looked at Sarah, who was getting sicker by the minute, and then back at Jim. "My grandmother always said you never take anything from a mountain woman's garden without asking, and you never, ever disturb her plants." I felt cold all over, because I remembered now what Jim had done right before we left the garden. He'd pulled up one of those strange herbs and put it in his collection bag. "Jim," I said quietly, "what did you take?" He looked confused. "Just a sample, one little plant. It's what we came here to do, right? Collect specimens?" Mary closed her eyes. "Oh, Jim, what have you done?" That night, Sarah's fever broke and her rash started to fade. But Jim started getting sick. By morning, he had the same red welts covering his skin, only worse. Much worse. And I kept hearing that humming in my dreams. Jim's rash wasn't like Sarah's. Hers had been red and itchy, but his was dark purple and seemed to spread by the hour. By the second morning, the welts had formed patterns on his skin, circles and lines that looked almost like the plant arrangements we'd been documenting. "It hurts," he whispered. His voice was hoarse, and his lips were starting to turn blue. "It hurts so bad." Mary was checking his pulse when she froze. "Sam," she said quietly, "come look at this." She'd pushed up Jim's sleeve to check his arm, and what I saw made my stomach turn. The purple marks on his skin weren't random. They formed perfect spirals, just like the root patterns we'd found on the laurel bushes. "That's not possible," I said. "None of this is possible," Mary replied. "But it's happening anyway." Sarah was feeling better, but she was scared. We all were. Jim was getting sicker, and we were still 15 miles from our truck. Even if we could carry him that far, I wasn't sure he'd survive the trip. That's when we heard the dogs. It started as a distant howling, echoing across the bog. But it wasn't like any dog I'd ever heard. The sound was deeper, wilder, and it seemed to come from all directions at once. "Coyotes?" Sarah suggested hopefully. But Mary was shaking her head. "Too big to be coyotes, and there aren't supposed to be any wolves this far south." The howling got closer, and soon we could hear them moving through the brush around our camp. Large shapes in the fog, circling us but staying just out of sight. I grabbed my rifle from the tent. I'd brought it for bears, but I had a feeling we were dealing with something worse than bears. "Stay close to the fire," I told the others. "Don't go anywhere alone." That's when I saw the first one. It stepped out of the fog about 30 feet away, and it was the biggest dog I'd ever seen. But calling it a dog wasn't quite right. It was shaped like a dog, but it was easily the size of a small horse, with thick black fur and eyes that reflected the firelight like mirrors. When it opened its mouth, I could see teeth as long as my fingers. "Nobody move," I whispered. The creature stared at us for a long moment, then tilted its head back and howled. The sound was so loud and deep that I felt it in my chest like a physical blow. And when it finished, we heard answering howls from at least 6 other directions. We were surrounded. The dogs, or whatever they were, kept circling us all night. Sometimes we'd catch glimpses of them in the firelight, huge shapes moving just beyond our circle of safety, but they never came closer, and they never attacked. It was like they were waiting for something. Jim got worse during the night. The purple marks spread to his face, and he started talking to people who weren't there. "I'm sorry," he kept saying to the empty air. "I didn't know. I'll put it back." But the plant he'd taken was gone. His collection bag was sitting right where he'd left it, but it was empty. Not just the stolen plant. Everything he'd collected was gone. The bag looked like it had been cleaned out by careful hands. When morning came, the fog was thicker than ever, and the dogs were gone. But something else was watching us now. I saw her first as just a shape in the mist, standing about 50 yards away near the edge of the bog. An old woman, bent with age, wearing clothes that looked like they'd been sewn by hand decades ago. She stood perfectly still, and even though I couldn't make out her face clearly, I knew she was looking right at us. "Do you see her?" I asked Mary quietly. Mary nodded. "I see her." The old woman raised one hand, pointing directly at Jim, who was now unconscious and burning with fever. Then she turned and walked away into the fog, moving without making a sound. "We have to follow her," Mary said. "Are you crazy?" Sarah asked. "We don't know who she is or what she wants." But Mary was already standing up. "I think I do know what she wants. She wants us to bring Jim to her." "Why would we do that?" "Because she's the one who can heal him," Mary said. "And she's the one who cursed him in the first place." I didn't want to believe it, but I was running out of rational explanations. Jim was dying, and we couldn't get him to a hospital in time. If there was even a chance that the old woman could help him, we had to try. "Help me carry him," I told Sarah. We made a stretcher out of branches and my sleeping bag and loaded Jim onto it. He was barely breathing, and his skin felt like it was on fire. The purple marks had spread to cover most of his body now, forming pate, burns that hurt to look at directly. We followed the old woman's footprints in the mud, though I noticed something strange. Her feet barely seemed to touch the ground. The prints were so faint they could have been made by a child, not a grown woman. She led us deeper into the bog, to places where the ground was so wet we had to jump from hummock to keep from sinking. But somehow she never seemed to have trouble with the terrain. I'd catch glimpses of her ahead of us, always exactly the same distance away, walking steadily through mud that should have swallowed her up. After about an hour, we reached a place I'd never seen before, though I thought I'd explored every inch of Dolly sods over the years. It was a clearing surrounded by the biggest trees I'd ever seen in these mountains, ancient oaks and maples that must have been growing for hundreds of years. In the center of the clearing was a small log cabin that looked like it had been built some time before the Civil War. The old woman was waiting for us on the cabin's porch. Now that we were closer, I could see her clearly. She was tiny, probably not even 5 feet tall, with long white hair braided down her back. Her face was wrinkled like old leather, but her eyes were the palest blue I'd ever seen, almost white. She wore a long dress made of rough brown cloth, and her feet were bare despite the cold ground. "Bring him here," she said, and her voice was exactly what I'd expected, thin and crackling like dry leaves. We carried Jim up to the porch and set the stretcher down at her feet. She looked down at him for a long moment, then shook her head sadly. "Foolish boy," she said, taking what wasn't freely given. "Can you help him?" Mary asked. The old woman looked at Mary with those pale eyes. "You're Mountain Annie Thornfield's granddaughter, aren't you? I remember her. Good woman. Knew the old ways." "Yes, ma'am. Annie was my grandmother." "She taught you anything useful?" "Some things," Mary said quietly. The old woman nodded approvingly. "Good. You'll need to know them." She looked back down at Jim. "This one took something from my garden, ripped it right out of the ground without so much as a 'please may I' or 'thank you kindly.' The plants don't like that kind of treatment." "It was just for research," Sarah said desperately. He didn't mean any harm. The old woman's pale eyes fixed on Sarah, and Sarah took a step backward. Intent don't matter, child. Actions do. He took what wasn't his to take, and the plants want payment. What kind of payment? I asked. She smiled, showing teeth that were surprisingly white and strong for someone her age. That depends. What's it worth to save his life? The old woman's name was Granny Sods, and she'd been living in these mountains longer than anyone could remember. That's what she told us as she led us inside her cabin anyway. The inside was bigger than it should have been, with shelves covering every wall from floor to ceiling. The shelves were filled with jars and bottles containing things I couldn't identify, roots and leaves and powders in colors I'd never seen before. Bundles of dried herbs hung from the ceiling, giving the air a smell that was both pleasant and strange. In the center of the room was a large wooden table, and that's where we laid Jim. He was barely breathing now, and the purple marks had spread to cover his entire body. "How long has he been like this?" Granny Sods asked. 2 days, I said. She nodded and began examining him, running her hands over the marks on his skin. Where she touched, the purple faded slightly. "He's got maybe 6 hours left," she said matter-of-factly. "The plants are calling in their debt. They want him to feed their roots." "You mean he's going to die?" Sarah asked. "Oh, yes, unless someone pays what he owes." "What does he owe?" Mary asked. Granny Sods went to one of her shelves and pulled down a jar filled with what looked like black dirt. "This boy, too, took a grandmother root from my garden. Do you know what that is?" We shook our heads. "Grandmother root is older than your Christ, child," she said to me. "Older than any church or book of prayers. It's been growing in these mountains since before your people came across the ocean. One root can heal any sickness, cure any poison, mend any broken bone. But it takes 20 years to grow one root, and each plant only makes 3 in its entire life." I felt sick. No wonder she was angry. "I can grow another one," she continued, "but it'll cost me 20 years of my life. Or—" She paused and looked at each of us in turn. "One of you can take his place." "What do you mean?" Mary asked. "The plants need feeding. They'll take his life, or they'll take someone else's. Makes no difference to them." "That's murder," Sarah said. Granny Sods laughed, a sound like wind through dead leaves. "Child, I didn't make this bargain. Your friend did when he stole from my garden. I'm just telling you the terms." I looked down at Jim, who was getting weaker by the minute. Then I looked at Mary and Sarah, both of whom were staring at me like I should have an answer. "There's got to be another way," I said. "Maybe," Granny Sods said. "You could take my place." "What?" She gestured around the cabin. "Someone needs to tend the garden, keep the old knowledge alive, protect the plants from people like your friend there. I'm getting old, even for my kind. Been thinking it might be time to pass on the responsibility." "You want me to become a witch?" I asked. "Witch is your word, not mine. I prefer guardian. These plants have been growing in these mountains for thousands of years. They remember things your people have forgotten: how to heal without cutting, how to grow without poisoning the soil, how to live in harmony with the land instead of trying to conquer it." Mary stepped forward. "What would he have to do?" "Give up his old life, stay here in the mountains, learn the ways of the plants, protect them from those who would harm them." She looked directly at me. "And never leave these mountains again." I thought about my life back in civilization, my job at the university, my small apartment, my research papers that 12 people might read if I was lucky. Then I looked at Jim, dying because of something I should have prevented. "If I say yes, you'll heal him?" "I will." "And the others can leave safely?" "They can." I was about to answer when Mary grabbed my arm. "Sam, wait. There's something you should know." She looked at Granny Sods. "Tell him what happened to the last guardian." Granny Sods smiled. "Smart girl. Yes, there was another before me, young man about your age. That was, maybe 60 years ago now. He served well for a time." "What happened to him?" I asked. "He got lonely. started bringing people up here, trying to share the knowledge with them. The plants didn't like that. They took him in the end, just like they're taking your friend now. So I'd be alone up here forever? Not forever. Just until someone else is ready to take your place. She paused. Though that might be a very long time, most folks these days don't have the right kind of respect for growing things. I looked at Jim again. His breathing was so shallow I could barely see his chest moving. How long do I have to decide? About 10 minutes, she said calmly. But as I stood there trying to choose between Jim's life and my freedom, something occurred to me. The plants, I said. They're not evil, are they? They're just trying to protect themselves. Now you're starting to understand, Granny Sod said. And if I became their guardian, I could teach people the right way to study them, the respectful way. You could try, though most folks aren't much interested in respect these days. I made my choice. I'll do it, I said. I'll take your place. Granny Sods nodded approvingly. Thought you might. You've got the right kind of spirit for it. She went to her shelves and began mixing ingredients from various jars. As she worked, she sang in a language I didn't recognize, her voice blending with the wind outside. The mixture she created was thick and green, like liquefied moss. Give him this, she said, handing me a cup filled with the mixture. It'll draw the poison out. I lifted Jim's head and poured the medicine down his throat. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the purple marks began to fade, starting from his face and working their way down his body. Within minutes, they were completely gone, and his breathing returned to normal. He'll be fine now, Granny Sod said. Weak for a few days, but fine. Thank you, I said. Don't thank me yet, boy. You haven't learned what you've agreed to. That was 47 years ago. Jim recovered completely and never remembered much about what happened in those final hours. The official report listed the cause of his illness as an allergic reaction to an unknown plant species. Mary and Sarah kept our secret, though Mary came back to visit me several times over the years before she passed away. Learning from Granny Sods was harder than anything I'd ever done. She taught me to listen to the plants themselves, to understand their needs and their language. She showed me how to encourage certain growth patterns, how to heal sick trees, how to convince invasive species to find better places to live. But the hardest lesson was learning to be alone. Granny Sod stayed with me for 3 years, teaching me everything she knew. Then one morning I woke up and she was gone. No goodbye, no final instructions. Just gone. I found her body 6 months later, lying peacefully among her beloved plants, as if she'd simply decided to sleep there forever. The loneliness nearly broke me those first few years. I thought about leaving, about breaking my promise and returning to the world of people and buildings and paved roads, but every time I considered it, I'd remember Jim lying on that stretcher, dying from his own ignorance and disrespect. So I stayed, and I learned. I learned that the plants really do have their own intelligence, their own way of communicating. I learned that some of them remember things that happened hundreds of years ago, where the old Cherokee camps were, where Civil War soldiers died, where the first European settlers tried to build their cabins. I learned that my job wasn't just to protect the plants from people, but to protect the right kind of people from the plants. Researchers who came with respect and humility were welcomed. Those who came to exploit or destroy found themselves lost in the fog or suddenly remembering urgent business elsewhere. Over the years, I've guided a few dozen botanists and ecologists through dolly sods, teaching them the proper ways to study and document the plant life here. Some of them have gone on to become important voices for conservation and environmental protection. That's been my small contribution to the larger world. But I've also had to deal with developers who wanted to build roads through the bog, with hikers who thought it was funny to uproot rare plants, with hunters who left trash scattered across the meadows. Those people learned that some places fight back when you treat them badly. I'm 95 years old now, though I don't look it. The plants share their longevity with those who serve them faithfully, but I can feel my time coming to an end, and I've been watching for someone who might take my place. Maybe it will be that young graduate student who spent 3 weeks here last summer, carefully documenting the orchid populations with reverent patience. Maybe it will be the park ranger who always speaks to the trees when she thinks no one is listening. Or maybe it will be someone I haven't met yet, someone who will make the same choice I made all those years ago. Because the choice always comes. The plants see to that. Just last month, another research team came through, with soil testing equipment and sample bags, talking loudly about finding new species to patent for pharmaceutical companies. They didn't listen when I tried to warn them about treating the plants with respect. 2 of them got sick with that familiar purple rash. The third, a young woman named Dr. Sarah Chen, came to my cabin asking for help. I showed her the same jars and bottles that Granny Sods had shown me. I explained the same choice that was once explained to me. And now, as I write this, she's sitting by my fire, thinking it over. The plants are patient. They've waited thousands of years to find the right guardians. And they'll wait thousands more if they have to. But they won't be ignored, and they won't be disrespected. So if you ever find yourself in Dolly Sods, walking among the strange plant patterns and impossible gardens, remember this. You're not alone up there. Someone is always watching, always listening, always ready to teach the old ways to those willing to learn. Just make sure you ask permission before you take anything. The plants remember everything. My name is Elizabeth Ravencroft, and I've been a park ranger at Hawks Nest State Park in West Virginia for 17 years. People always ask about my last name. Yes, I'm related to those Ravencrofts from Salem. My family's been running from that shadow for 300 years, but it finally caught up with me in the summer of 1966. I should have known something was wrong when the birds stopped singing. It was August, the kind of hot that makes your clothes stick to your skin before you even step outside. 88 degrees with humidity so thick you could practically swim through it. I was walking the trail that leads to the old tunnel entrance, the one they built back in the 1930s that killed all those men. 764 workers died digging that 3-mile hole through the mountain. Most folks don't know that. The company covered it up real good. The tunnel overlooks the New River Gorge, 600 feet straight down to the water. Beautiful view, but something felt off that morning. No wind at all, which was strange for up here on the cliff. And quiet. Too quiet. I've got a master's degree in Appalachian history. I know the stories about this place, the real ones the tourist books don't tell. How Union Carbide brought in mostly black workers from the South, promised them good jobs, then worked them to death in silica dust so thick they couldn't see their hands in front of their faces. How the company doctors knew what was happening and lied about it. How they buried the dead in unmarked graves and told their families they died of tunnelitis, like it was some made-up disease instead of lungs turned to stone. My family taught me to fear the supernatural growing up, but college made me skeptical of ghost stories. I figured education would protect me from the old superstitions. I was wrong about that. The first visitor complaint came on a Tuesday. A family from Ohio said they saw men in old work clothes near the tunnel entrance, but when they tried to take pictures, the men vanished. The father started coughing so hard his wife had to drive him to the hospital in Beckley. Doctors said his lungs looked like he'd been breathing in rock dust for months. That got my attention. You don't get silicosis from a day trip to a state park. More reports came in over the next week. A school group from Charleston, half the kids started wheezing after visiting the tunnel overlook. A geology professor from West Virginia University swore he heard drilling sounds coming from inside the mountain, even though no work had been done there in 30 years. I started keeping detailed records like I was trained to do. Checked for environmental hazards, tested the air quality, looked for anything that might explain what people were experiencing. Everything came back normal. Clean air, safe water, no unusual radiation levels. But the complaints kept coming. And they all had the same strange details. Men in 1930s work clothes, sudden breathing problems, and sounds of construction where no construction was happening. I knew I had to investigate the tunnel itself. I'd been avoiding it for years, even though it was part of my territory. Something about that place always made me uncomfortable. The opening yawns like a mouth in the side of the mountain, big enough to drive a truck through. They sealed it with a chain-link fence back in the 50s, but you can still see maybe 50 feet into the darkness before it curves away. Standing there that morning, looking into that black hole, I felt like something was looking back at me. The temperature dropped at least 10 degrees just walking up to the fence. In August heat. That didn't make any scientific sense. I radioed back to headquarters, told them I was going to document the tunnel site for a report. My supervisor, Jim Colbank, had been after me to write up a proper historical survey of the disaster anyway. Tourist interest was growing, and the state wanted to know if we should develop it as an educational site. "Be careful up there, Liz," Jim said over the radio. "Some of the old-timers say that place is cursed." I laughed it off. "Come on, Jim, you sound like my grandmother." But as I set up my camera equipment, I noticed something that made my hands shake. The chain-link fence had been cut. Recently. The metal edges were bright and sharp, not rusted like they should be after years of mountain weather. Someone had been inside the tunnel. I should have called for backup right then. Protocol said not to investigate break-ins alone, especially in remote locations. But I was curious, and curiosity has always been my weakness. I squeezed through the gap in the fence and took my first steps into the tunnel. The temperature drop hit me like walking into a freezer. My breath came out in little puffs of vapor, which was impossible in August heat. The air tasted metallic, like old blood mixed with rock dust. My flashlight beam only reached about 20 feet before the darkness seemed to swallow it up. The tunnel curved to the right after about 50 yards. I'd seen the old blueprints. It was supposed to run straight as an arrow for 3 miles through the mountain. But blueprints can be wrong, especially ones from the 1930s when surveying wasn't as precise. That's when I heard the first voice. "Water break, 5 minutes." It echoed from deeper in the tunnel, clear as day. A man's voice with a southern accent, the kind you still hear in rural Kentucky and Tennessee. I called out, "Hello, park ranger here. This area is closed to the public." Silence. I waited a full minute, then started walking deeper into the tunnel. My footsteps echoed strangely, like there were other feet walking with me. Every few steps I'd stop and listen, but the extra footsteps stopped too. The tunnel walls were covered with some kind of white residue that looked like frost, but didn't feel cold when I touched it. It came off on my fingers like powder. Silica dust, I realized. After 30 years, there should have been no trace of the original construction left. 50 yards deeper, I found the first piece of equipment. A pneumatic drill, the old-fashioned kind they used in the 30s. It was sitting upright against the tunnel wall like someone had just put it down for a break. The metal was clean and oiled, no rust at all. When I touched it, the handle was still warm. "Hey there, Missy." I spun around, heart hammering. A man stood about 10 feet behind me wearing coveralls and a dented hard hat. He was covered in white dust from head to toe, and when he smiled, his teeth looked gray. "You shouldn't be down here," he said. "Ain't safe for a lady." I fumbled for my radio, but my hands were shaking too bad to work the controls. "Sir, this area is restricted. I'm going to have to ask you to leave with me." He took a step closer. That's when I saw his eyes. They were completely white, like someone had painted over them with milk. "Can't leave, Missy. Gotta finish the job. Mr. Reinhardt says we gotta finish the job no matter what." Reinhardt. I knew that name from my research. Dennis Reinhardt was the Union Carbide supervisor who pushed the workers harder when they started getting sick. He died in 1963. The man took another step toward me. "You got the look of the Ravencroft girl, Dr. Ravencroft's kin. He was the one told us we was fine, told us the dust wouldn't hurt us none." My great-grandfather had been a doctor. I'd found his name in some of the old company records, but I'd never dug deeper into what role he'd played in the tunnel disaster. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said, backing toward the tunnel entrance. "Oh, you know," the man said. His voice was getting rougher, like his throat was full of gravel. "Your blood knows. That's why you come down here. That's why he's been waiting for you." "Who's been waiting?" The man's smile got wider. Too wide. His mouth stretched almost to his ears. "The one who made the deal. The one who got rich while we died coughing up our lungs. He's still here, Missy, still collecting on that contract." I turned and ran. Behind me I heard laughter that echoed off the tunnel walls like thunder, and underneath it the sound of drilling getting louder and louder until it felt like it was drilling into my skull. I didn't stop running until I was back in the sunlight, gasping for breath beside my truck. My radio was crackling with static, and when I finally got it working, Jim's voice came through, distorted and strange. "Liz, we just got a call from Fayette General Hospital. They've got a park employee in the emergency room with severe lung trauma. Says she went into the tunnel this morning." I looked down at my hands. They were covered with white dust that hadn't been there when I first went in. "Jim," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "I'm the park employee." He was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Liz, you need to get to the hospital. Now." The chest x-rays showed my lungs were full of silica particles. The doctor, a young resident named Martinez, kept shaking his head and asking how long I'd been exposed to construction dust. When I told him it was less than an hour, he looked at me like I was lying. "Ma'am, this level of silicosis takes months or years to develop. Are you sure you haven't been working around mining or construction?" I wasn't sure of anything anymore. That night, lying in the hospital bed with an oxygen mask over my face, I called my grandmother in Salem. She was 93 and still sharp as a tack. "Grammy, I need to know about great-grandfather Ezekiel. What did he do during the tunnel construction?" There was a long pause. "Why are you asking about that, child?" "Because I think his past just caught up with me." She sighed, the kind of deep sigh that carries the weight of family secrets. Ezekiel Ravencroft was, as the company doctor for Union Carbide during the Hawk's Nest project, he diagnosed hundreds of workers with tuberculosis and pneumonia when he knew perfectly well they were dying of silicosis. The company paid him extra to keep quiet about it. My blood went cold. "Grammy, how many men died?" 764. Most of them buried in unmarked graves. Ezekiel kept the real medical records, but after the lawsuit started, he burned them all. Said he made a deal to protect the family name, no matter the cost. "What kind of deal?" "The kind you don't make with earthly powers, Elizabeth. The kind that follows a family line until someone pays the debt." I hung up the phone and stared at the ceiling. Outside my hospital window, storm clouds were gathering over Hawk's Nest Mountain, even though the weather forecast had called for clear skies. Something was coming for me. Something that had been waiting in that tunnel for 30 years, feeding on the injustice and the covered-up truth about all those dead workers, and now it knew I was a Ravencroft. I checked myself out of the hospital against medical advice. The oxygen treatments had helped, but the doctors wanted to keep me for observation. I couldn't afford the time. Every hour I delayed, the thing in the tunnel grew stronger. Jim met me at the park headquarters with a stack of files and a worried expression. "Liz, I've been digging through the historical records since yesterday. What I found, it's not good." He spread out photocopied documents across his desk. Medical records, death certificates, company memos, all the paperwork the state had inherited when Union Carbide dissolved their local operations. "Your great-grandfather wasn't just the company doctor," Jim said. "He was the one who convinced the families not to sue, told them their men died of natural causes, that there was nothing anyone could have done." I picked up one of the death certificates. The cause of death was listed as pneumonia, but someone had written in pencil at the bottom, "Silicosis, 100% preventable, ER." Ezekiel Ravencroft's handwriting. "He knew," I whispered. "He knew they were all dying, and he helped cover it up." "There's more." Jim handed me a company memo dated September 1931. "This is from Dennis Reinhardt to the Union Carbide Board of Directors. He's reporting that Dr. Ravencroft has successfully contained the worker unrest regarding health concerns and that production can continue on schedule." My hands were shaking as I read the document. At the bottom, in the same handwriting as the death certificate, someone had written, "Agreement honored, payment received, DM." DM, I said. What's DM? Jim was quiet for a moment. Then, in the old records, the workers had a name for the thing they said lived in the deepest part of the tunnel. They called it the devil of the mine. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the hospital air conditioning. Jim, I need to go back into that tunnel. Absolutely not. You nearly died yesterday. Those workers are still there. I saw one of them. They can't rest until someone acknowledges what really happened to them, until someone tells the truth. And you think it has to be you? I looked at the death certificate in my hands, at my great-grandfather's handwriting. My family helped cause this. Maybe it has to be my family that fixes it. That evening I drove back to the tunnel overlook. The storm clouds had gotten thicker, turning the sky the color of old bruises. No other visitors were around. Word had gotten out about the health hazards at the site, and the state had posted warning signs. I parked next to the fence and sat in my truck for a few minutes, trying to work up the courage to go back inside. The temperature was dropping fast, and I could see my breath fogging the windshield even though it was still August. A tap on my passenger window made me jump. A black man in work clothes was standing beside my truck. Like the first worker I'd seen, he was covered in white dust, but his eyes were normal, brown and sad and very much alive. I rolled down the window. Are you dead? Yeah, honey. Been dead since 1932. Name's Thomas Washington. I was 17 when I came here from Alabama, looking for work to send money home to my mama. His voice was soft, with a thick southern accent. You're the Ravencroft girl, the one whose granddaddy helped kill us. I nodded, not trusting my voice. Most of the others, they angry at your family, want to see you suffer like we did. But I've been watching you these past few days. You got a good heart. You want to make things right. How? I asked. Thomas pointed toward the tunnel entrance. The devil, he made a deal with your granddaddy and with Mr. Reinhardt. Promised them money and power in exchange for our lives. But deals like that, they got to be paid in full. Your granddaddy's debt passed down to you. What does it want? Your life, same as it got ours. But there might be another way. Thomas leaned closer to the window. The devil. He feeds on injustice, on secrets and lies. But if the truth comes out, if people know what really happened here, he loses his power. What truth? All of it. The real number of dead. How the company knew we was dying and didn't care. How your granddaddy helped them cover it up. How they buried us without even putting our names on stones. Thunder rumbled overhead, and Thomas looked up at the darkening sky. He's coming for you tonight, honey. Been building his strength all these years, and now he's ready to collect. You best get inside and face him, or he'll just hunt you down wherever you run. I grabbed my flashlight and my grandmother's rosary from the glove compartment. It wasn't much, but it was all I had. Thomas, I called as I got out of the truck. Will you help me? He smiled. The first real smile I'd seen since this all started. Been waiting 74 years to see justice done. Wouldn't miss it now. Together, we walked toward the tunnel entrance, the cut-in. The fence had gotten bigger, like something had torn it open from the inside. The darkness beyond looked absolute, like it went on forever. He's in the deepest part, Thomas said. 3 miles in, where the tunnel ends. That's where the worst of it happened, where the men died fastest from the dust. I squeezed through the fence and into the tunnel. This time, Thomas walked beside me, his presence somehow making the cold and darkness a little less frightening. The tunnel walls were different now. Instead of white silica dust, they were covered with names carved into the stone. Hundreds of names, all the workers who had died. We carved these ourselves, Thomas said, after we died, but before we understood we couldn't leave. Wanted to make sure someone would remember us. At the end of the tunnel, 3 miles into the mountain, we found him. The devil of the mine sat behind a desk that looked like it belonged in a 1930s corporate office. He wore a perfectly pressed suit and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. When he looked up at me, I felt like I was staring into a furnace. "Miss Ravencroft," he said in a voice like silk over broken glass. "I've been waiting so long to meet you." The devil stood up from behind his desk, and I realized he was tall, maybe 7 feet, with shoulders that seemed to stretch forever. His suit was expensive, the kind worn by men who made fortunes off other people's suffering. "Please, sit down," he said, gesturing to a chair that hadn't been there a second before. "We have business to discuss." I stayed standing, clutching my grandmother's rosary. "I know what you did. The deal you made with my great-grandfather." His smile got wider. "Ah, yes, Dr. Ezekiel Ravencroft. Such a practical man. I offered him wealth and protection for his family in exchange for a small favor, keeping quiet about some unfortunate workplace accidents. See, 164 men died. That's not an accident. Deaths were regrettable, but profitable. The tunnel was completed on time and under budget. Union Carbide's stock price doubled. Everyone won." Thomas stepped forward, and the devil's eyes flicked to him with annoyance. "Everyone except us," Thomas said. "We died choking on rock dust while you and the company men got rich." "You were compensated fairly for your labor," the devil said. "The terms of employment were clear." "The terms were lies," another voice shouted from the shadows. More workers stepped into the light. Dozens of them, all covered in white dust, all with the same angry, desperate look in their eyes. "You promised safe working conditions," one called out. "You said the dust wouldn't hurt us," said another. "You told our families we died of natural causes." The devil waved his hand dismissively, and the workers fell silent, though I could see them still trying to speak. "The living are talking," he said to me. "The dead have already had their say." I felt sick watching the workers struggle against his control. "Let them go." "I'm afraid that's not possible. They are bound to this place by the injustice of their deaths. As long as the truth remains hidden, they remain my employees." "Then tell the truth. Release the real medical records. Admit what happened here." The devil laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "My dear girl, I am not in the truth business. I deal in profitable arrangements. Speaking of which," he picked up a contract from his desk. "Your great-grandfather's debt has come due." The paper looked old but not yellowed, written in red ink that seemed to move in the light. "The agreement was simple," the devil continued. "In exchange for the good doctor's silence about the tunnel deaths, I provided wealth and protection for the Ravencroft family. Your great-grandfather lived ved comfortably until his death. Your grandfather became a successful businessman. Your father earned a medical degree and a comfortable practice. I thought about my family's, inexplicably, good fortune over the years, Dad's medical practice that succeeded even during hard times, the college scholarships that seemed to appear out of nowhere, the way problems just resolved themselves." "What's the price?" I asked. "The same price those workers paid. Your life given willingly to seal the contract permanently." "And if I refuse?" The devil's smile turned cold. "Then I collect anyway. But your death will be considerably more unpleasant. And your family's protection ends. Your nephews, your sister's children, they'll find life quite difficult." Thomas was shaking his head frantically, trying to warn me of something. "There is, however, one alternative," the devil said. "You could take your great-grandfather's place in the arrangement, become my agent in the world above, help me expand my operations. There are so many profitable enterprises that require a little discretion about worker safety." I looked at Thomas, at all the dead workers surrounding us, men who had come here looking for honest work to support their families. Men who had died slowly and painfully while their families were lied to about the cause. "I have a counteroffer," I said. The devil raised an eyebrow. "Oh?" "I make the truth public. All of it. The real number of dead, the company cover-up, my great-grandfather's role in it. In exchange, you release these workers to whatever comes next. And what do I gain from this arrangement? Nothing. That's the point." The devil's expression went from amused to furious in an instant. The temperature in the tunnel dropped another 20 degrees and ice started forming on the walls. "You cannot simply cancel a contract, Miss Ravencroft. Debts must be paid." "Then I'll pay it," I said. "But not the way you want." I pulled out my cell phone. No signal this deep in the mountain, but I'd come prepared. I'd written everything down, all my receipt. Arch about the tunnel disaster, my great-grandfather's involvement, the real story of what happened here. I'd emailed it to Jim before coming to the tunnel with instructions to send it to every newspaper and history professor in West Virginia if I didn't check in by morning. "You want my life?" I said to the devil. "Take it, but the truth dies with me, and these men get to rest." The devil lunged forward, his human appearance melting away. What remained was something made of shadow and flame and corporate greed, reaching for me with claws that looked like fountain pen nibs. That's when Thomas and the other workers broke free of his control. 764 men, dead for over 30 years, surged forward as one. They didn't attack the devil. Instead, they formed a protective circle around me. "The girl speaks truth," Thomas shouted. "First time anyone's spoken truth about our deaths in 70 years. "Truth has power," another worker called out. "More power than your contracts." The devil's scream shook the entire mountain. Rocks started falling from the tunnel ceiling, and I could hear the sound of the mountain itself groaning under some immense pressure. "You cannot do this," the devil raged. "The contract is binding." "Contract was based on lies," Thomas said. "Lies got no power when truth comes out." The workers began to glow with a soft, warm light that pushed back the devil's shadows. One by one, they started to fade, peaceful expressions on their faces as they finally found rest. "Thank you," Thomas whispered to me as he began to disappear. "Tell our families we didn't die for nothing. Tell them we were remembered." The devil was shrinking, his corporate form dissolving like smoke and wind. "This isn't over, Ravencroft," he snarled. "There are other deals, other contracts, other families who've sold their souls for profit." "Then I guess I'll have to go find them too," I said. With a final scream of rage, the devil vanished. The corporate desk, the contract, even the names carved into the tunnel walls, all of it faded away, leaving just empty stone and the sound of my own breathing. I was alone in the tunnel, but for the first time since this began, I wasn't afraid. I made it back to the surface, just as the sun was coming up. My phone had signal again, and I called Jim to let him know I was alive and that he should send out the story I'd written. The article ran in the Charleston Gazette-Mail 3 days later. "The Hidden Tragedy of Hawk's Nest Tunnel. A ranger's investigation reveals decades of cover-up." Other newspapers picked it up, then national media. Historians started demanding access to the sealed Union Carbide records. Within a month, the state approved funding for a proper memorial at the tunnel site. All 764 names carved in black granite with the real story of what happened to them. I resigned from the Park Service and used my inheritance, money I now knew came from my great-grandfather's blood money, to establish a foundation for the families of industrial accident victims. It felt like the right way to spend devil's gold. The tunnel itself is different now, peaceful. Tour groups come through regularly, and I lead some of them myself, telling the real story of what happened here. No one's gotten sick since the memorial was dedicated, but sometimes, late at night when I'm working on cases for the foundation, I'll get a call or an email from someone whose family got mysteriously wealthy after a mining accident or factory fire, someone whose great-grandfather made a deal they don't fully understand. The devil was right about one thing. There are other contracts out there, other families living on blood money while the dead go unremembered. I keep a bag packed in my closet now. Research materials, camping gear, my grandmother's rosary. Because I've learned something about the supernatural that they don't teach in college. Sometimes the dead can't rest until the possible living tell the truth. And sometimes, telling the truth is the most dangerous thing you can do. Last week I got a call from a woman in Pennsylvania. Her family's been wealthy for 3 generations, ever since her great-grandfather started a mining operation that had an unusual number of accidents. She's been hearing voices in her basement, seeing men in old work clothes. I'm driving up there tomorrow. Some debts can only be paid in truth, and if my family's legacy taught me anything, it's that someone has to be willing to pay. The dead are counting on it. My name is Margaret Ironside, and I've been a park ranger for 16 years. People always ask me how I got into this work. The truth is, something killed my family's sheep when I was 12 years old, ripped them apart and left them to bleed out in the field. The state wildlife people said it was a bear, but I knew better. Bears don't drain blood from their kills. That's what brought me to Blackwater Falls State Park in West Virginia. I wanted to understand what really lives in these mountains. The park sits in the Canaan Valley, surrounded by red spruce forest that's been here since before people walked this land. The falls themselves drop 60 feet into a canyon so deep that sunlight barely touches the bottom. When the water hits the rocks below, it sounds like thunder. In winter, ice builds up along the walls until the whole canyon looks like a frozen cathedral. I've handled over 200 bear encounters in my time here. I know the difference between a black bear track and a brown bear track, between claw marks on bark and scratch marks from deer antlers. I can tell you which animals are sick just by how they move, and I've tracked wounded elk through 3 feet of snow for 12 miles without losing the trail. People trust me because I know my job. When hikers call about strange noises in the woods, I'm the one who goes out to check. When livestock goes missing near the park borders, I'm the one who looks for tracks. Most of the time, there's a simple answer. A coyote pack, maybe, or a bear that's learned bad habits from garbage. But December of 1989 was different. The snow started falling on December 15th and didn't stop for 6 days. By the time it was done, we had 3 feet on the ground and temperatures hitting 12 below zero. The roads into the park became impassable. Radio contact with the outside world cut in and out. We were on our own. That's way. And the killings started. On December 18th, I got a call about dead deer near the visitor center. Not unusual. Winter is hard on wildlife and weak animals die. But when I hiked out to look, what I found made my stomach turn. 3 white-tailed deer, all adults, all healthy-looking. They'd been torn apart but not eaten, just killed and left to freeze in the snow. The tracks around the kill site were wrong. Too big for any dog, too narrow for a bear. The paw pads measured 8 inches long with claw marks that dug deep grooves in the frozen ground. Whatever made these prints had to weigh at least 400 pounds. I took photos and plaster casts of the tracks. I measured the spacing between the prints. I examined the bite marks on the deer. Everything pointed to a predator that shouldn't exist in these mountains. That night, I called Pete Colwood, the senior ranger who trained me when I first started. Pete had worked these mountains for 25 years. If anyone would know what could make tracks like that, it would be him. "Margaret," he said, when I described what I'd found, "you need to be careful out there. There are things in these mountains that don't show up in wildlife management textbooks." "What do you mean?" There was a long pause. "Come by my cabin tomorrow. There are some old newspapers I want to show you." I couldn't sleep that night. I kept thinking about those tracks, about the way the deer had been killed. Whatever did it was strong enough to break a full-grown buck's neck with one bite. But it hadn't eaten anything. It killed for the sake of killing. Outside my cabin, the wind howled through the spruce trees. The sound usually comforts me. I've lived alone in these mountains for so long that the forest sounds are like old friends. But that night, the wind sounded different. Hungry. Pete's cabin sits on the north side of the canyon, where the old logging road used to run. When I arrived the next morning, he had a pile of yellowed newspapers spread across his kitchen table. The headlines made my skin crawl. "Devil Dog Terrorizes. Logging Camp, 1892. Mysterious Beast Kills 3 Workers, 1893. Shadow Wolf Vanishes into Mountain Mist, 1894. The stories all described the same thing, a massive black wolf that hunted during winter storms. It killed with surgical precision, targeting the strongest men in camp. The survivors all said the same thing. It had glowing red eyes and moved like smoke through the trees. "Every 20 years or so," Pete said, pouring coffee with hands that shook slightly, "something wakes up in these mountains. The old-timers used to call it the Beast of Blackwater." "You think that's what killed those deer?" Pete looked out his window toward the canyon. "I think you need to set up cameras along the game trails. And Margaret, don't go out alone after dark." I spent the next 2 days setting up trail cameras along every deer path within 5 miles of the kill site. Modern equipment, infrared triggered, weatherproof. If something was hunting in my park, I'd get pictures of it. On December 21st, I checked the cameras. What I found made no sense. 4 of the 6 cameras had stopped working. The battery indicators showed full power, but the memory cards were blank. The 2 working cameras had captured dozens of photos of normal wildlife: raccoons, possums, a few deer. But in 3 of the photos, there was something else. A shadow, moving between the trees in the background. It looked like a wolf, but the proportions were all wrong. Too tall, too lean. In one photo, you could see what might have been eyes reflecting the camera flash. They glowed red, just like the old newspaper stories described. That afternoon, I found the second kill site. This time, it was a black bear. A big male, probably weighed 300 pounds. It had been dragged 200 yards from where it died, leaving a blood trail in the snow. The killing blow had crushed its skull. Whatever did it had jetty W's powerful enough to crack a bear's head like an eggshell. But here's what made me start carrying my rifle. The tracks around the kill site formed a perfect circle, like the killer had been studying its work. Planning. Thinking. I called the state wildlife office and requested backup. The dispatcher told me all the roads were still blocked by snow. Earliest they could get someone out was maybe Christmas Day, if the weather cleared. I was on my own. That night I double-checked all the locks on my cabin. I loaded my rifle and kept it next to my bed. I'd grown up in these mountains, hunted since I was 10 years old. I wasn't afraid of any normal predator, but this wasn't normal. Around midnight, I heard scratching at my door. Slow, deliberate scrapes that went on for almost 10 minutes. I grabbed my rifle and a flashlight, but when I opened the door, there was nothing there. Just massive paw prints in the snow leading up to my front steps. 8 inches long, 4-inch wide pads, claw marks that gouged the wood. Whatever had made those tracks had been standing on its hind legs when it scratched my door. The marks were 7 feet off the ground. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I sat in my chair with the rifle across my knees, listening to the wind and watching the windows. Every shadow looked like movement. Every creak of the cabin settling sounded like footsteps. Just before dawn, the scratching started again, this time at the back door. When I looked out the window, I saw something that still gives me nightmares. A shape moving through the trees behind my cabin. It walked upright like a man, but it was too tall, too broad at the shoulders. Its eyes caught the moonlight and threw it back like mirrors, red mirrors. It stood there for maybe 30 seconds, just watching my cabin. Then it dropped to all 4s and vanished into the forest faster than anything that size should have been able to move. I knew then that Pete was right. Something had woken up in these mountains. Something that had been here long before the logging camps, long before the Park Service, maybe even long before people. And it was hunting. The next killing happened on December 23rd, and this time it wasn't an animal. I got the call from Jenny Mills, who ran the small camp store near the park's east entrance. 2 hikers had been overdue since the previous afternoon. Their car was still in the parking lot, covered with snow, but there was no sign of them. The weather had cleared enough for me to get my truck partway up the mountain. I hiked the rest of the way to where their tracks led into the forest. Following a trail in fresh snow should have been easy, but these tracks told a story that made my blood freeze. For the first mile, everything looked normal. 2 sets of boot prints, walking side by side, occasionally stopping to look at something or take photos. They'd been following the Blackwater Canyon rim trail, probably hoping to see the falls. Then the tracks changed. At a bend in the trail, the hikers' footprints became panicked. They started running. Their boot prints dug deep into the snow, showing they were moving fast, stumbling, desperate. Mixed in with their tracks were the now familiar paw prints. But this time, there were more of them. I counted at least 4 different sets, maybe 5. The creatures had been herding the hikers, driving them deeper into the forest like wolves hunting deer. The trail led to a clearing about 2 miles from the main trail. That's where I found what was left of them. I won't describe what I saw in detail. It's enough to say that the hikers had been torn apart with the same surgical precision as the deer and the bear. But there was something worse, evidence that they'd tried to fight back. Broken tree branches, disturbed snow, signs of a struggle that went on for several minutes. These people had seen what killed them. They'd looked into those red eyes and known they were going to die. Around the cave, ill sight, the paw prints formed the same perfect circle I'd seen before. But this time, there were other marks in the snow. Symbols, almost like letters, scratched into the frozen ground. I couldn't read them, but they looked deliberate, intentional. The creatures weren't just hunting, they were communicating. I radioed for help, but the response was the same as before. Roads still impassable, backup still days away. I was told to secure the scene and wait for the state police. But I couldn't just wait. Not with people dead and more hikers still trapped in the park by the storm. I spent the rest of that day checking every cabin, every shelter, every place where visitors might have taken refuge from the weather. Most were empty, but I found 3 families holed up in the group camping area near the falls, city people who'd come up for a winter hiking trip and got caught by the storm. I moved them all into the main visitor center where the walls were thick and the doors were solid. I didn't tell them about the hikers I'd found. I just said there were dangerous animals in the area, and they needed to stay inside until help arrived. That night, the attacks on the visitor center began. It started around 10 o'clock with scratching sounds on the roof. Long, slow scrapes that moved from one end of the building to the other. Then silence for maybe 20 minutes. Then the scratching would start again, always from a different direction. The families huddled in the main room while I patrolled the building with my rifle. Through the windows, I could see shapes moving in the darkness, big shapes that flowed like liquid shadow between the trees. At midnight, something hit the front door hard enough to rattle the frame, then the back door, then the windows on the east side. They were testing the building, looking for weak points. Around 2 in the morning, the power went out. In the darkness. I could hear them breathing outside the windows, deep, wet sounds that didn't come from any normal animal. One of the children started crying and her mother tried to quiet her, but the sound seemed to excite whatever was outside. The scratching on the roof got faster, more urgent. Then I heard something that made my hair stand up. A voice. Human words, but spoken in a tone that was all wrong. Too deep, too rough, like gravel in a cement mixer. "Let us in," it said. "We just want to talk." Nobody spoke. The families pressed closer together in the dark. I moved to the window and looked out. There was a man standing in the snow about 50 feet from the building, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing what looked like an old-fashioned coat. His face was hidden in shadow, but his eyes reflected the moonlight. Red eyes. "We've been waiting so long," he said, and I realized the voice was coming from everywhere at once, echoing off the canyon walls. "Come outside. Make this easy." I raised my rifle and aimed at the figure. "Get away from here." The thing that looked like a man tilted its head, studying me through the window. Then it smiled, and I saw teeth like broken glass catching the light. "You know what we are," it said. "You've seen the old stories. We've been here longer than your park, longer than your towns, longer than your memory. These mountains belong to us." "Not anymore," I said, and pulled the trigger. The bullet hit the figure center mass and sent it stumbling backward, but it didn't fall. It looked down at its chest, then back up at me. The smile got wider. "Silver would have been better," it said. Then it raised its arms, and its coat fell away like water. What stood there in the moonlight wasn't a man anymore. It was the biggest wolf I'd ever seen, black as midnight and tall enough to look me in the eye through the window. Its teeth were longer than my fingers. Its claws scraped grooves in the frozen ground. But it was the intelligence in its eyes that scared me most. This thing was smart, maybe smarter than me. It threw back its head and howled, and the sound echoed off the canyon walls like thunder. From the forest came answering calls, dozens of them surrounding the visitor center. We were trapped. The siege lasted until dawn. They never tried to break down the doors or windows. They just waited outside, letting us know they were there. Occasionally, one of them would scratch at the walls or howl, keeping us terrified and awake. When the sun came up, they melted back into the forest like smoke. I got the families loaded into my truck and drove them to the park boundary, where the state police finally met us. I told them about the dead hikers, but left out the parts about talking wolves and red eyes. Sometimes the truth is too big for official reports. But I went back. I had to. That afternoon, I hiked to Pete's cabin to tell him what had happened. I found him sitting on his porch with a rifle across his knees and dark circles under his eyes. "They came here too," he said before I could speak. "Surrounded the place all night. But they didn't attack. Just watched." "Pete, what are these things?" He looked older than his 63 years. "My grandfather used to tell stories about the first Scottish settlers who came to these mountains. Some of them brought more than just their belongings. They brought old curses, old hungers, things that should have stayed in the highlands. You're talking about werewolves. I'm talking about something worse. These things aren't men who turn into wolves. They're wolves that learned to look like men. And every 20 years, when the winter storms are bad enough to trap people in the mountains, they hunt." He handed me something wrapped in oiled cloth. Inside was an old revolver and 6 bullets that gleamed like mirrors. "Silver," Pete said. "Melted down from my grandmother's jewelry. She knew these stories too. Said her grandfather killed one of these things back in 1873. The bullets felt warm in my hand. Why are you giving me these?" "Because I'm 73 years old and my knees don't work like they used to. But you're young and you're strong and you've got something to prove. These things will keep killing until someone stops them." I knew he was right. The families I'd saved were safe, but there would be others. Spring hikers, summer campers, hunters in the fall. The beasts had tasted human blood again. They wouldn't stop. That night, I went hunting. I hiked to the deepest part of the canyon, where the old logging roads ended and the forest became truly wild. I followed the creek upstream, looking for caves or rocky overhangs where large predators might shelter. The moon was dark, a new moon, just like Pete had said in the old stories. Perfect hunting weather for creatures that moved like shadows. I found their lair around midnight. It was an ice cave behind the frozen waterfall, hidden so well I almost walked past it. But I could smell the death inside, old bones, rotting meat, the metallic scent of blood. I clicked on my flashlight and stepped inside. The cave went back farther than my light could reach. The walls were covered with scratches, symbols like the ones I'd seen around the kill sites. The floor was littered with bones, animal bones, but also human remains that looked decades old. At the back of the cave, in a natural chamber carved by centuries of flowing water, I found them. 5 wolves, each one bigger than any natural animal should be. They were sleeping, curled together like a pack of normal wolves, but their size gave away their true nature. The smallest one was the size of a pony. The largest, the alpha male, was easily 6 feet from nose to tail. In the darkness, their eyes glowed like embers. I raised the revolver and aimed at the alpha's head. My hands were steady, my breathing calm. This was just another predator control situation, I told myself. These things were dangerous animals and they needed to be removed. But as I tightened my finger on the trigger, the alpha opa net its eyes and looked directly at me. "We wondered when you would come," it said without moving its mouth. The words formed in my head like thoughts, but I knew they weren't mine. I fired. The silver bullet took the creature between the eyes and sent it crashing into the cave wall. The other 4 beasts exploded into motion, but they moved wrong, too fast, too fluid, like they were made of liquid instead of flesh and bone. I spun and fired again, catching one of them in the chest. It screamed, a sound no wolf should make, and dissolved into shadow. The remaining 3 circled me in the narrow cave. Their eyes burned like hot coals, and their teeth gleamed in my flashlight beam. "You cannot kill us all," one of them said in my head. "We are eternal. We are the hunger that lives in dark places." "Maybe," I said, and fired my third shot. "But I can make a good start." The bullet shattered against the cave wall as the creature flowed aside like smoke. They were toying with me now, showing off their supernatural speed. But I'd been hunting in these mountains for 30 years. I knew how pack predators behaved. I backed toward the cave entrance, keeping the flashlight beam moving so they couldn't use their shadow form trick. They followed, staying just out of range, waiting for me to make a mistake. At the cave mouth, I stopped and turned off the flashlight. In the darkness, their red eyes were the only things visible. 3 sets of burning coals, moving in a circle around me. I waited until they were bunched together, then fired twice in rapid succession. 2 screams. 2 shadows dissolving into nothing. The last beast, the largest after the alpha, stood alone in the cave entrance. Its red eyes fixed on mine, and for a moment I could feel its mind pressing against my thoughts, trying to break my concentration. "You have killed the pack," it said, "but you cannot kill the hunger. We will return. In 20 years, 50 years, 100. These mountains will always be ours." I had 1 bullet left. 1 chance. "Not if I have anything to say about it," I told the creature, and fired my last silver bullet. The beast collapsed with a sound like falling timber. Its red eyes flickered once, then went dark. The cave fell silent. I radioed for backup and waited until morning for help to arrive. When the state wildlife team finally made it up the mountain, they found 5 large wolves in the ice cave. Unusually large, they agreed, but not supernatural. Just animals that had gotten too comfortable around humans. The official report blamed the deaths on a pack of hybrid wolves. Part timber wolf, part domestic dog. Escaped from a private wildlife facility, probably. It happens more often than people think. I didn't argue with their conclusions. Sometimes the truth is too strange for paperwork. But I kept the empty revolver Pete had given me, and I learned to cast silver bullets from old jewelry and scrap metal. You can never be too careful in work like mine. That was 36 years ago. I retired from the Park Service in 2010, but I still live in the mountains, still patrol the old trails when the winter storms get bad, still check the ice caves behind Blackwater Falls every December when the moon goes dark. The attacks stopped after that night in 1989. No more mysterious killings, no more red eyes watching from the forest. The mountains felt clean again, the way they should. But I remember what that last creature said about returning. The old newspaper articles Pete showed me were dated 20 years apart, 1872, 1892, 1912. If the pattern holds, if these things really do come back, well, let's just say I'm not the only one keeping watch anymore. There are others now, people who've heard the stories and understand what's at stake. We pass information through informal networks, teach our children and grandchildren to recognize the signs. We keep silver bullets and know where to find the old caves, because some things are too, dangerous to leave to chance. The mountains are quiet these days, peaceful. Hikers come up from the cities to see the falls and breathe the clean air. They take their pictures and buy their souvenirs and go home with stories about the beautiful wilderness of West Virginia. They never know how close they came to becoming stories themselves. But I know, and I'm still watching, just in case.